So again, thank you everyone for joining us, and a special thanks, Tyler and Alex, for your film and for joining us here today, and also thanks to Chelsea Rotman for joining us as well. And I first just want to talk about the problem of plastic pollution. So I've read there will be more plastic than fish in our oceans by 2050. I've read a terrifying stat from Science that says the disease rate in coral goes from 4% to 89% if it's been in contact with plastic. Walk us through the specific problems, whether it's potential problems for human health, potential problems for coral and the knock-on consequences for that, but what's the scope of the problem, I guess, if we want to start there?
Chelsea, I think you will, yeah.
Okay, so the scope of the problem. So I'll start global as opposed to local. So I would say that in the beginning we thought of plastic as this middle of the ocean problem, and we would go out in the middle of the ocean on trips like what you just saw, and we'd find plastic in every single sample. Now we know that it's not just the middle of the ocean, it's also on the coastlines, it's also in the rivers, we find it in our lakes, we find it in dust, we find it in drinking water, we find it in seafood. So the contamination is ubiquitous. When it comes to impacts, when it comes to things like the coral that you're talking about, fishing debris, there's no doubt that animals get entangled in this debris, that animals ingest this or eat this debris like big plastic bags, and that can be the cause of death. And when it comes to microplastics, we know that it's infiltrated every level of the food chain, and that it can cause impacts to individual animals. So obviously, we're not going to sit out here and be doom and gloom because there's a lot of good solutions, but the reality is that the contamination is real, it's global, and that it can indeed cause impact, so those solutions are needed. You want to add anything?
No, I think that's the easiest way to sum it up right there.
All right. And so in terms of solutions, there are some, I'm going to ask everyone to put up their hand at, well, let's start now, actually. So who would support a ban or a tax on plastic bags? All right, so pretty much everyone. And this, all right, so let's start there then. So is that a plausible solution? And forget just bags, let's talk about single-use disposable plastics more broadly. Is this something that makes sense and that our government should be pursuing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's a really complicated issue because, you say the word tax or ban, and that can raise a lot of alarms in certain people, and think that you're trying to control them or control their purchasing decisions. But I think that's sort of what we need, because it's the public education aspect of this is really important. But if we sit around and wait for everyone to get fully aware of the scope of the challenge and what's needed and the speed at which we need to tackle a lot of these things, I think we'll be just even further behind than we need to be. So it's important to be proactive, and I think that in some cases it has to be approached by a case-by-case basis, whether it's straws or bags, or certain types of packaging. I think that it is really a case-by-case basis. So you can't just say outright, let's tax all single-use disposable plastics, but there are certain ones that are extremely problematic that need to be dealt with right away. So in one of our latest episodes, The Big Leak, we talk a lot about flushable wipes. And that is one, sanitary wipes, they're allowed to be labeled flushable, because there's no real guidelines on what can be labeled flushable. Like, you could label anything flushable, technically, if you can fit down your toilet. You could sell it as a flushable item. So it doesn't actually mean anything. But companies are allowed to get away with it because people like that idea. Oh, I can just get rid of it. It's something that I'm going to use to wipe something disgusting, and I can get rid of it. But those are really problematic because we're being told to put plastic into the wastewater stream. We're not being told to put it in the garbage or put it in recycling. We're take plastic, put it in water directly. So those are the ones that I think require a more proactive approach, where you're saying, okay, maybe we need an outright ban, or we need to change the labeling guidelines, or we need a tax on this item, because if people want to use it, there's a cost to that. There's a direct cost to our wastewater recycling system. We pay $250 million a year in Canada just cleaning out garbage from wastewater treatment plants. And we have, wastewater, water infrastructure deficit that's running into the tens of billions of dollars right now. So, that's 250 million we're spending every year to clean up people's garbage. That 250 million should be going towards doing the repairs and upkeep of our water infrastructure system. So,
and speaking of money,
I sort of went off on a tangent there, but those are the specific types of ones where you can say this one needs a more direct, fast approach with like types of taxes.
No, it's good. It's good you raised the question of money, because it gets to the question of who should be paying the costs of plastic pollution. And so I really wish we had a different phrase than extended producer responsibility. We need a better phrase that is more understandable, I think, that by the general public, including by me. So walk us through the idea of extended producer responsibility, the status of it in various jurisdictions. Let's start here in Ontario and in Canada, and how we can improve that.
So first of all, let's start with what is extended producer responsibility. Basically what that means is it's sort of like producer pays. So it's this idea that the material that's put out there, that there's a fee on it that the producer pays in order to collect it back. And so in Ontario, I believe we have like a shared system where the funding that the industry pays goes in to help pay for 50% of our waste management system. In British Columbia, it's 100%, and the industry is completely responsible for the waste at the end of at the end of life. And I think when it comes to this idea of who pays, I absolutely think that producers should help pay. And for example, globally, we produce about 300 million tons of plastic per year. And so if you put a penny tax, extended producer responsibility, whatever you want to call it, on every pound of plastic produced, you'd create a $6.8 billion fund globally, and increasing as the plastic production goes up. So this funding can be used to subsidize and pay for our waste management systems and for our recycling systems. So that's my best example of that. I don't know if you have more to say.
That's great.
And you might want to keep the mic, because this is another question that I had about a recycling system. So I've read, and I don't know if the number is exactly right, but I read 11%, but say around 10% of plastics that are recyclable are actually recycled, which is a shockingly low number. And yet it's a number that makes sense once I look at even the habits of myself and those around me, because various restaurants I go to, I don't know where to put the containers necessarily. It's a collective action problem for a reason, because it's so hard to figure everything that you need to do on your own. And so the role of the recycling system, let's start there, and how we can improve that horrible number of 10% and get it as close to 100% as possible.
So how many people in this room think it's confusing what you can and can't put in your recycle bin here in the city of Toronto? Most of us. Who in this room can tell us, where do you go to figure out that information? Does anyone know where you find that list? Yeah. The website, the Waste Wizard, right? So you can go online and you can look at the Waste Wizard and it tells you what to put in your bin. But the reality is it's confusing, and the average person's not going to do that. So oftentimes we have contaminated recycling systems, and in Toronto about 20% of the recycling in our bins cannot actually be recycled. So that's one of the reasons I think why we have a low recycle rate. But I think, going back to this extended producer responsibility, if brands are responsible for recovering that waste and getting it into a recycle system, and they pay less if it's recovered and more if they don't, then the reality is more and more of it's going to be recovered. If you have a container deposit scheme, so if we get a nickel on every bottle that we return, then we're more likely from that incentive to return those bottles, right? So we need to incentivize recycling, but also make it less confusing, right, in order for all of us to recycle properly.
And while we're there, we have an audience question to ask but right on point. What happens to the plastic that we put in our recycling in Toronto? Mm-hmm. And so walk us through, assuming we can ever figure this out and we get well above 10%, close to 100%, what happens? And walk us through this idea of a proper life cycle to plastics.
Yeah. So in an ideal world, what happens in Toronto is that blue bin goes into the truck that comes, and they pick it up and they take it to something called the MRF, which is the recycling facility. It goes into the facility, it goes into a machine, And as the plastics or the material is coming down, a laser hits it. And if it's a certain type of plastic, it blows it into a certain direction into a bin. And then if it's, let's say that you have a bin of polystyrene or your plastic code number 6, that'll go to market. It'll go to the market who's going to recycle that plastic. So sorting it is really, really important. So when it's contaminated and the laser can't quite tell what goes where, or if it's contaminated and it has peanut butter all over it and you can't quite get it clean, that's where sometimes things fall off. And this is also why you can't recycle black plastic in the city of Toronto, because the laser absorbs into the black and it can't tell what plastic it is. So we have an advanced MRF by having this laser, and that's why so many things go into our bin compared to Ottawa and other places. But if you've ever wondered about black plastic, that's why.
So I've got 2 more questions, and then we're going to run through the audience questions. And I didn't ask this the last time that I had you guys before me. And then I read an article in the National Geographic that said, in this patch in the middle of the ocean that you guys were exploring, 46% of the plastic there comes from abandoned and lost fishing gear. That is crazy to me. And if that is such a significant part of the problem, first, maybe there's a different number globally, but if it's such a significant part of the problem, and so much of the attention is on plastic straws and plastic bags, how do we return some of the attention to lost and abandoned fishing gear? And frankly, what do we do about it?
Well, the sort of the global stats are, as we said in the episode, about 80% is estimated of all the plastic in our oceans is coming from land. So that's coming from places like Toronto. Only about 20% of globally of all the plastic in the ocean is coming from the shipping and fishing industry. So I imagine if you're doing the stats just from what's in the middle of the ocean, that could definitely be higher, around the 40% mark. But I mean, the global fishing industry is a massive. It's an industrial fishing fleet, and there's Alex and I have done some work on illegal and unregulated fishing and looked at a lot of sustainable fishing. And when you see just the amount of fishing vessels that are in the ocean, it's staggering when you can actually see it. And so it's not really surprising when you think about how much the fish feeds people around the world and this mega global fishing industry. And it's, fuel is expensive. And so when fishing gear gets too tangled or discarded, it's cheaper for them, instead of paying to dispose of it properly when they get to land and have to carry that weight, they just dispose of that fishing gear in the ocean because it's kind of a lawless place, the high seas. So it's terrible. There's more regulations needs to be enacted, but in the high seas, it definitely things happen that shouldn't happen, and it's a really, really tough situation to try and police and regulate.
So let's start in terms of solutions specifically at the government level. So first, there's a consultation going on that the minister is engaged in, and if you have specific ideas that you want me to share with the minister, I plan to do a writing report in say August 20th. It was sort of my internal deadline to send it to Minister McKenna. I would encourage every one of you to email my office with ideas so I can incorporate in my own comments to the minister. So that's a good thing that they're engaged on it. We also saw that engagement at the recent G7 meeting where there's a plastics charter. Now I read that and it sounds wonderful. The objectives are noble. The language, though, at times is quite high level and vague, and so open to the panel, but how do we bring those, first, how important is this to actually getting changed through in a global sense and making more people aware of this and care about this, but how do we bring those grand ideas down to specific domestic action?
So I personally love the Plastics Charter, if any of you have read it. And when I read it, I almost fell out of my chair because it was so progressive. And I've been working on this for a while, and I've never seen something so systemic, meaning, so there is no silver bullet solution to plastic debris. And so the reality is you need solutions at every level, and the Plastics Charter did a nice job at this. So from a level that you and I can get behind, right, they talk about outreach and education to teach people about waste and have us be more waste literate so we can think about our own actions and our own behavior and how we can consume and use our products in a way that are actually managed properly and not going into the environment. Then they talk about the next kind of thing we can understand, which is getting rid of, banning, taxing, whatever you want to call it, some of the single-use items that aren't as necessary, but that we see as the most common items found on our beaches, like some of the water bottles that maybe for drinking water aren't necessary, plastic straws, some of the packaging that's unnecessary, maybe switching to things that are more recyclable, etc. So then you have that in there. But then you have this whole thing at the bottom, which is about really changing our whole waste management system, having less go to landfill and having more be recycled and reused, which means producing products and items that are going to be recycled and reused, and creating a recycling system that we can all understand so we know exactly where to put everything. So it really does a nice job at tackling every level, as well as a global fund to help support waste management around the world in places that are developing that are increasing their plastic usage but don't have a landfill at all. And so at the end of the day, the only thing they can do is throw it on the ground in the environment. So it's actually quite a nice charter as long as it happens. So one of the best things you can do is say, you know what, that's a great charter, but we'd really like to see that actually happen.
And to that end, there's a question from the audience about timelines. And my expectation is that the charter was adopted at the G7 meeting recently in June. And so the ministers now engaged in a consultation with the idea being, how do we take some of the ideas that were in that charter and implement them in a domestic way and tackle this problem here in Canada? At the same time, $100 million has been set aside to help other countries deal with this problem as well, knowing that Canada is not the solution to the global problem. We're part of the solution. And so my expectation of the timeline is that this fall we're going to see the government put forward a strategy to tackle this domestically in a more serious way. If not the fall, we're, I guess, looking at this spring, but I would be surprised if we don't see. Minister McKenna is already on a plastics tour, as it were, this summer, and so this is top of mind for her in particular. So